Coming to you live from a cabin deep in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. Turn down the lights, get yourself a drink, and let's settle in for tonight's broadcast.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Mysteries. My name is Nathan and I'm your host for this new segment we are running here on the radio entitled Things That Go Bump in the Night. I love saying it that way each and every time. If you didn't catch our reel earlier, Things That Go Bump in the Night will be a segment of the podcast with me where we have a conversation back and forth. You and I will have a chance to discuss these paranormal topics, these different theories and exciting news. And then once I've gone over the content, we'll have a back and forth. You'll be able to ask questions and I may or may not have answers. You'll be able to leave comments, your opinion, and it's really to build a sense of community here at Midnight Mysteries Radio. The goal is for us to do this, 1 to 2 to 3 times per month. And then when Mike's and my schedule overlap with each other, when we have another chance to have a guest onto the show, we'll put out a episode with all 2 or all 3 of us together. Tonight, we're going to talk about the balloons and unidentified objects we've been hearing about in the news. Then we're going to talk about the similarities and dissimilarities between them. We're going to talk about what we've seen with these patterns and where we've seen these patterns in the past and the news coverage that surrounded them. So starting off on Saturday, February 4th, U.S. fighter jets shot down a suspected spy balloon off the coast of South Carolina. The balloon was suspected to be from the PRC, or the People's Republic of China. The Canadian Armed Forces, as well as the Royal Canadian Air Force, reported that this balloon floated across Canada, down across Alberta, further into Montana, and across the rest of the states before being shot down. That's over 5,000 kilometers or 3,000 miles that it traveled before being shot down. The Canadian Americans government's reasoning for that was, well, we didn't want it to harm any civilians, and we'll get into some more of these claims later. On February 5th, the Chinese Foreign Ministry claimed that it was a device used for meteorology. So they admitted that it was theirs. They believed that it was, plausible for them to claim that it was used to study the atmosphere and weather patterns. However, America's State Department, as well as the FBI, put out a statement on February 9th that claimed the balloon had equipment that was clearly for intelligence surveillance, including multiple antennas and equipment for geolocation data. So locations of certain organizations, facilities, and buildings, etc. Various U.S. officials claimed the balloon was flying over sensitive military installations, including the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, where there are over 150 silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles, including the nuclear-capable missile, the Minuteman III. On February 10th, the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration, spotted a car-sized unidentified object, their words, not mine, near Anchorage, Alaska. The FAA's warning caused flights to divert or even to return to the airport. The object was shot down in Alaska airspace by an F-22 fighter jet. At first, there was rumors that this was just another balloon, another spy balloon. However, the Defense Department came forward on February 13th and said that the object, quote-unquote, broke into pieces when it hit the frozen sea, which made them wonder if it was indeed, again, quote unquote, something else. They also said it lacked any system of propulsion. After this object was down, Senator Dan Sullivan claimed that other objects were also spotted on Alaskan radar, but they appeared to be anomalies. The Senate Armed Services Committee said, and I quote, "There were things that were seen on radar, but couldn't be or weren't explained." On February 11th, Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted, and I quote, "I ordered the takedown of an unidentified object that violated Canadian airspace. The object was cylindrical in shape and over the Yukon. It marked the third time in a week that U.S. fighter jets have taken down objects in North American airspace. This object, according to the senior administration at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, caused some anomalies, first appearing, then disappearing, and then reappearing on radar." February 12, 2023, the Pentagon claimed the U.S. military shot down another identified object over Lake Huron. This object was the shape of an octagon, and when rumors about it being another balloon circulated, NORAD and Northern Command said, "We're calling them objects, not balloons, for a reason." There's also the claim that this sighting also affected radar, but I can't seem to substantiate it offhand. It was somewhere here in my notes, but I've lost it. These are the four main objects we've been hearing about in the news over and over. However, more objects were causing strange radar glitches, according to NORAD, including one over Montana where they scrambled fighter pilots to try and intercept these objects that were appearing and disappearing off of radar. Other countries have now come forward as well to talk about similar objects being shot down over their airspace. On February 3rd, Colombia's National Air Defense System claimed that they shot down an object over the northern sector of their country. China, Russia, Ukraine, and others have also made claims about unknown objects being shot down over their skies. Canadian retired Major General Scott Clancy, former director of operations at NORAD and former deputy commander of the Alaskan NORAD region, said that these objects, quote unquote, had a path in proximity to sensitive DoD sites, and the altitude they were flying could be a hazard to civilian aviation and thus raised concerns. So, we're going to talk about the similarities and dissimilarities between these different objects. Object number one. First of all, China claimed that this was their balloon. They disputed the purpose of this balloon, but they did say that it was their balloon. Clearly, they didn't obtain permission to fly their own meteorological equipment over North America to study atmospheric phenomena, etc. But on top of that, there was spy equipment found on that balloon. So we're going to get back to that one later, but I think for now we can safely label it as identified. Objects 2, 3, and 4, and the more that have been popping up on radar in other countries, etc., seem to have the same distinguishable characteristics of, number one, no visible means of propulsion, number two, interference with radar, and number three, appearing near or around military installments. So, what's the government's current hypotheses? Well, one, they believe that one of these objects is a hobby balloon. The Northern Illinois Bottle Cap Balloon Brigade reported that its balloon had gone missing over the west coast of Alaska. That object, and again, the DoD said that they prefer to call these objects not balloons because the one specifically in Alaska appeared to shatter across the frozen water or the cold sea, has not been recovered, but they are saying that it could be that hobby balloon. So there's a few of them sending mixed messages. Number two is that radar was changed to detect smaller objects. And I want to go through this point really quickly. If I had more time, I'd want to unpack my thoughts behind it a bit more, but I'm not spending time on this point later, so I want to get it out of the way. The belief that radar changed to detect smaller objects. So they're saying that after they spotted the first, big object, the Chinese balloon, that they thought, there might be, other spy balloons out there. So we got to generalize our surveillance tech to pick up smaller objects. But on July 7th, 2022, last year, the Pentagon said that balloon surveillance activity has been seen in the past few years, and had added that the U.S. has taken steps to ensure that balloons do not collect sensitive information. And with that, balloon number one is no small object. Object number one, which is the Chinese spy balloon, is no small object. General Glenn Van Herk, commander of the NORAD and the U.S. Northern Command, told reporters in a briefing that the balloon was 200 feet tall. The balloon was 200 feet tall, or about the size of a 20-story building, and weighed several thousand pounds. That's massive. That's the width of some of our largest passenger jets, but in terms of diameter and radius, it's huge. And it's a bit confusing because in the last few years, in the middle of the COVID relief bill that Congress pushed through, there was a UFO disclosure section where a few Navy pilots came forward with footage called the Tic Tac objects, and these objects were booking it at unimaginable speeds across the ocean. They were defying gravity. Some people have came forward and said, maybe they're drones, but these were trained fighter pilots who have engaged with drones before, and these objects were moving at 90-degree arcs and much faster than drones ever could. But guess what? Radar picked up these objects. These are small objects. We pick up aircraft all the time too. And if this balloon, was the size of a 20-story building, and we're also picking up aircraft, it doesn't really make sense that our current radar systems wouldn't detect objects this size or even possibly smaller. And it doesn't explain what other countries are currently seeing with objects over their skies. Now, we're going to talk about where we've seen these patterns in the past and the news coverage that surrounded them. And when the White House first came out and did a briefing on these objects, it gave me similar vibes to an incident we're going to cover here in just a minute. But I'm going to play that clip for you.
Before I turn it over to the Admiral, I just wanted to make sure we address this from the White House. I know there have been questions and concerns about this, but there is no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns. Again, there is no indication of aliens or terrestrial activity with these recent takedowns. Wanted to make sure that the American people knew that, all of you knew that, and it was important for us to say that from here because we've been hearing a lot about it. I'm not. Would you tell us? I'm just, I loved E.T. the movie, but I'm just going to leave it there.
I'm just going to kill that clip there, but she says, I know there have been questions and concerns about this, but there's, again, no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns. There's a level of certainty there, but almost there's some familiarity there in terms of addressing it. You can hop onto Google. There's some high-ranking members of the Pentagon and USAF who have said they're not ruling out anything when they were asked about extraterrestrials. And of course, any proper investigative sciences would say you don't rule out anything until you have the evidence to rule it out, right? But what she said gave me eerily similar vibes to the Phoenix Lights press briefing. It almost brings a silliness to the situation. It provides levity. It, gives people reassurance that the right people are handling this. And to quickly summarize the Phoenix Lights, on March 13th, 1997, there was an incident which was covered by eventually the New York Times, Washington Post, MSNBC, and a dozen or more so large news companies, dozens of books, documentaries, articles, etc., where it went over how people witnessed a series of lights in the shape of a triangle and approximately the length of 5 American football fields slowly float across Phoenix, Arizona from around 8 to 10 p.m. And it spooked people. It spooked both professionals. It spooked people both in the military and government sectors, and it spooked people in private sectors. And so briefly after the incident, Arizona government Fife Symington held a briefing to address the lights after the thousands of people had reported seeing them. I'm going to play that clip for you now.
The pot.
And he went to humorous and controversial lengths not to stir the pot. He held a news conference after the Phoenix Lights to announce the mystery had been solved.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please.
In the alien costume, the governor's chief of staff.
Now, this just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
UFO enthusiasts were not amused, especially since the governor was believed to have seen nothing. But now he's coming out.
We'll continue that train of thought here in just a minute. So again, it's the whole, let's make light of this situation, make everybody laugh, and not actually address the deeper questions at play. Like, even from a non-paranormal perspective, even from a non-conspiratorial perspective, it's like, okay, you've identified one of these objects as a spy balloon, but you're not identifying these other objects. And they're flying close to military installations that have nuclear capabilities, and they're messing with radar, and they're in the paths of airplanes, civilian aircraft. Like, don't you think it deserves to be taken a bit more seriously than, we can assure you it's not aliens, so just don't worry about the whole thing. What's interesting to note, however, is that 10 years later, in an interview with both ABC News and CNN, Symington revealed that he did, in fact, and still does, believe that unknown object was a UFO. He said, "I'm a pilot, and I know just about every machine that flies. It was bigger than anything I've ever seen. Other people saw it, responsible people. You could just tell it was otherworldly." He also talks about another incident where he witnessed a UFO, but we need to move on. Following this is probably the most famous UFO sighting of all time. And again, guys, I'm not saying these objects we've been going over are UFOs. I mean, in terms of strict definitions of them being unidentified flying objects, sure, but in the context of us as a paranormal community and other dimensions and extra-dimensional biological entities or extraterrestrial biological beings, I don't know. I'm just trying to list some of the similarities I've seen in larger cases, and I want you guys to have that conversation with me. So, it's probably the most famous UFO sighting of all time, Area 51. On June 14th, 1947, a rancher named Mac Brazel and his son Vernon were driving across their property northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. While driving, they came across, and I quote, "a large area of bright wreckage. The metallic-looking object was scattered across the gravel and sagebrush of the New Mexico desert. Razzo commented that he contacted the local sheriff, Sheriff George Wilcox, who contacted the commander of the Roswell Army Airfield's 509th Composite Group located just outside of town. Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer from the base, was sent to investigate more thoroughly. Later, the Army returned to collect the rest of the wreckage. Shortly after, the intelligence office gave a statement to the Roswell Daily Record and the Daily Record saying the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into the possession of a flying saucer. So initially, a UFO was reported to have been collected, and I've got a picture of that newspaper here up on the screen. RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. However, on July 9th, 1947, the War Department in Washington claimed the debris collected on Brazil's ranch were the remains of a weather balloon, and the Roswell's Dispatch morning headline read, "Army debunks Roswell flying disc as world simmers with excitement." And again, my job here isn't to say whether Area 51 was a real encounter. It could very well have been Project or Operation Mogul. I don't know. But my job here is to point out that there's a parallel between the news coverage today and the news coverage then in terms of UFO documentation. At first, the Army came out and said, hey, it's a flying saucer. It's a bit confusing how they would go from knowing that specifically and issuing a press release, which has to go through multiple levels of approval before it can be released from the military base, to actually it was a weather balloon. I do want to point out a document from the Roswell area that came out a few years later. And just like we read with these unidentified objects today and the reports over the last few weeks, more than one object was seen in multiple locations, and similarly, objects were frequently seen in the Roswell area. This document is called the Guy Huttell document. Guy Huttell was a graduate of George Washington University in Washington, D.C. In 1934, he entered the FBI as a special agent. In December 1936, he was named acting head of the FBI's Washington field office. While in office on March 22, 1950, Guy Huttell authored a document called Flying Saucers and Information Concerning. It was addressed to the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and recorded and indexed in FBI records. It detailed an account by one of the field agents with an Air Force investigator. The Air Force investigator had reported that 3 flying saucers were recovered in New Mexico. The document goes on to say the saucers, were described as being circular in shape with raised centers, approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, but only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits used by speed flyers and test pilots. It goes on to say that although these creatures are human-like in appearance, the biological and evolutionary process responsible for their development has apparently been quite different from those observed or postulated in Homo sapiens. The document continues with, since it is virtually certain that these craft do not originate in any country on Earth, considerable speculation has centered around what their point of origin might be and how they get here. This document is interesting in a few ways, but most namely, the similarity with radar equipment radar equipment messing with these objects, causing them to crash, or more radar anomalies like referenced earlier, which caused the discovery of these objects and hypothetically these beings that were reported in this investigation. So we've gone over some of the similarities between the unidentified objects we're seeing today and some of the most famous objects in instances past. We do a deeper dive into UFOs and unexplained phenomena in our UFO episode on our Midnight Mysteries YouTube page and Spotify account and Google Podcasts page. So go check it out there. But I'm not saying any of these are UFOs. What I am saying is that there are some very specific similarities to these bygone experiences with UFOs and UFO sightings. That being said, there are some dissimilarities. Number one, these objects we're seeing today are moving pretty slowly. Still pretty fast for jets to chase them, but they're not maneuvering like we see in all these other cases. They don't seem to be breaking the laws of physics in terms of 90-degree point turns at accelerated rates. We do see that they don't have any visible means of propulsion, but if it's a balloon, you wouldn't. At the same time, they are going down a specific path. They are ending up beside these military installations and over these populated areas. So there does seem to be some sort of internal control mechanisms. The second dissimilarity that I'm noticing, and this gets my spidey senses going, is the fact that all of these large media companies are covering it. And they hint towards the terminology unidentified flying objects or unidentified objects. And I know that's, as accurate you can get in terms of vernacular, but at the same time, when there's been a community of people covering these experiences for years, when there's been mass sightings like the, sighting in South Africa or in New England or the sightings we see here in Canada, like Groom Lake Groom Lake's in the States, like Cold Lake or over other military installations, when you've got high-ranking people like the former Defense Minister of Canada, Paul Hellyer, talking about his belief in UFOs and aliens, when the media that seems to have hidden this stuff or been coerced or pressured into hiding this stuff starts saying, maybe this is it. Maybe this is aliens. Maybe this is true UFOs according to the sense of the definition. I get suspicious. I do. Again, paranormal nomenclature aside, conspiracies aside, every major news and television and radio station, aside from Midnight Mysteries, is owned by 6 companies across the world. And I'll do an episode on that in the future here. I did an episode on that on a past podcast I led, but that's something you could pull up for yourself. When these 6 companies are dictating everything we see and hear and read, and they control it. Again, conspiracies aside, companies have agendas. They want to manipulate, they want to coerce, they want to make a profit by any means necessary. I get suspicious when I start seeing the same message purported across them. Now we're going to dive into our time of conversation for the reported podcast for this episode, specifically of things that go bump in the night. You won't hear that conversation in the future. You will be able to hear the conversation as we read texts and comments and messages as they come. But for tonight, those who are listening after the fact, thank you for joining us. Again, we're going to be running things that go bump in the night monthly with yours truly. I'm going to be doing an episode on ley lines in the next week or two, and I can't wait for you to join the conversation. We'll see you then.